Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Why Supply Chain Security Just Hit OWASP's Top 3. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's session. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's session, and we will be making a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides available in a follow-up email tomorrow. If you do have any questions at any time during the session, please go ahead and throw them into the Q&A. We might take some of them during the presentation, or we'll save a few minutes at the end to take questions. For those of you attending here today, we do offer a certificate of attendance so that you could submit it for CPE credit. We are not affiliated with CPE, but we are happy to provide a certificate saying you attended today's session. So if you do want that, please feel free to reply back to either the invitation email or to the follow-up email tomorrow, and I'll get that out to you. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you, Chase.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everybody for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Really pumped to talk about the latest update to the OWASP top 10 list, and specifically the new item number 3, software supply chain failures, went from not being a thing on the list to being the third item for some interesting reasons. And we're going to talk about what that means and why. Yeah, my name is Chase Snyder. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Eclipsium, and I'm joined by the esteemed Paul Asadorian, who's a Principal Security Researcher here. Paul, you want to introduce yourself a little more?
Sure. Thanks, Chase. Paul Storian. I do podcasts. I do the Below the Surface podcast for Eclipsium, Paul Security Weekly. My day job is doing security research type stuff. So handling disclosures, helping out in discovering and reporting vulnerabilities, and lots of other things as needed in security research land.
Yes. Paul's so humble. He's also done some incredible hardware hacking. You should Google Paul Asadorian hardware hacking and dig into it, but not until after this webinar. All right, let's get into it. Yeah, like Melissa said, this is a lot more fun and interesting if we have some audience participation. So just like put your questions in the chat and we will read them out loud and talk about them as we go through, or we'll save them if they're more relevant to a future section. But we will get to them. It's always more fun to have a two-way conversation here. Um, but with that, yeah, we'll dive right in. So, quick overview before we get into the supply chain topic, just of what changed. So, this is the first update of the OWASP top 10 list. Should we zoom it out even more and say, what is OWASP? It stands for what? Open Web Application Security. I don't, it's widely known. If you're in this webinar, you probably know what it is, but they put out this top 10 list where they do this elaborate set of calculations to try to paint a picture of what the top application risks are, um, based on a series of data from CVEs and CWEs, risk scores, and also community survey. And they update this thing about every 4 years. So 2025 was the first update since 2021. There was one in 2017. This thing is like 20, 25 years old now. And it's kind of a widely referenced benchmark or system. It's a thing people use to try to understand the risk landscape when it comes to application development. Um, I don't know, Paul, what are your thoughts about OWASP in general, how it's changed, and particularly about this sort of diagram we have about the updates that occurred in the OWASP list this year?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's changed a lot over the years. I remember early OWASP top 10, being about those tried and true, somewhat pretty straightforward web application attacks. And then I think as time went on, it's very similar to how security or insecurity has evolved in other areas, right? The defenses got a little better, so the attacks had to get a little more advanced. And in my opinion, the OWASP top 10 has kind of kept up with those changes. If you've done any kind of security testing on a web application today, you kind of understand that landscape. It's not similar to, pen testing in the 90s or early 2000s, right? It's not as straightforward as, oh, like, hey, look, there's an open port and I can just log in or I have an exploit for it. Today, exploits are chained. A lot of web application vulnerabilities are the same kind of thing. You need to kind of chain them together. There are exceptions to that, but there's a lot of protections that have been put in place for SQL for injection, right? SQL injection, command injection. It's often more difficult today to get that working in an application. So you have to go to these like there's like really awesome web application vulnerabilities, and they're all documented, I think, pretty well on the OWASP top 10.
Yeah, they do an incredible amount of work to try to depict as an accurate view of the landscape as possible, but it has gotten so much more complex over the years to do that. I mean, one thing that I see happening that you can sort of see in this diagram, but we'll get way deeper into it, is that there's been a lot of sort of consolidation and moving up in abstraction layers of how they categorize these things. So server-side request forgery used to be its own whole item, and then I think it got consolidated into broken access control. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
and so
we
there's
could
a
make
lot of
the
that sort of,
case, right?
yeah.
We could make the case either way. I won't disagree that it is a broken access control. So,
Yeah, exactly. It's like they have to make these calls that are sort of like, while they're using a ton of data and they're doing a lot of analysis, there's also just sort of judgment calls and perception that they have to account for. And that's, a lot of respect for how much they try to incorporate that stuff. This fun whiteboard graphic depicts just a few of the changes in the underlying data set that they use, which really demonstrates pretty effectively, I feel, how much more complicated it has gotten since they started this thing, just since 2021. So just in 4 years since the last update, the number of CVE records that they mapped to CWEs. So yeah, CWE is oh God, I always struggle.
common
There we go.
weakness enumeration. So when
Common
you
weakness
create,
enumeration
so
versus
whoever's
common vulnerabilities and exposures, right?
Yeah, so when you create a CVE record, um, it is part of the enrichment data, right, that you can assign common weakness enumeration categories to that particular vulnerability. Um, there's a lot under that happening under the covers, right? Like one thing is why do we have so many more CVEs today than we did even in just 2021? I think there's a couple of driving factors there. One, there's a lot more CNAs or CVE numbering authorities where organizations don't have to go to MITRE and say, "Hey, can I have a CVE entry?" They can issue them themselves. It's typically companies that own software, the big ones, Microsoft, Apple, Google, and a lot of other companies that produce software can issue their own CVEs. There's also a lot of security research companies that can issue CVEs on others' behalf as well. The other change was the Linux kernel project became a CNA, and they're issuing CVEs for, I believe, I don't know if it's pretty much or if it really truly is every bug in the Linux kernel. Their argument is any bug in the Linux kernel could potentially be abused for it to cross a security boundary. Again, I could probably argue, both sides of that coin as well. But they are issuing a lot of Linux kernel is a huge code base, right? And a lot of active development, which causes a lot more CVEs. Also, WordPress, there's a lot of WordPress plugins with a lot of vulnerabilities that also tend to skew the data. And I think the kind of the icing on the cake is we're using AI technologies to help aid us in finding vulnerabilities. Now, can you just fire up an AI engine and go, "Hey, find me all the vulnerabilities in this"? Typically, that results in slop. However, there is an appropriate way that people are using AI to help augment and enhance our capabilities. So, I think that's, in my mind, why we have so much more data to deal with in the CVE database.
Enhance. Yeah, I think I haven't looked at what the actual number netted out to, but maybe 75% of the way through 2025, it was predicted there was going to be between 40 and 50,000 new CVEs that had been issued, which is it's so many more than in previous years. Like
Yeah,
it's only going up. And yeah, I think it's not that there strictly are more vulnerabilities other than the fact that there is more software. It's that there's more research happening. So
right.
more being found. There probably are more, but not quite to that rate. But it's like lots of stuff is being found. Older vulnerabilities are being found. Older vulnerabilities are being exploited. And something I found super interesting about this edition of the OWASP list is that this is the first one that they've done since the CVSS version 4 risk scoring algorithm came out, and they noted in their description of their methodology that CVSS v4 is a fundamental enough change to the algorithm that it can't easily be sort of averaged in or incorporated to the calculations that they use to kind of combine CVSS v2 and v3. And apparently in CVSS v2, there was a pretty significant issue with how they were measuring exploit and impact that was kind of dragging up the overall risk score in a way that was addressed in CVSS v3. And then v4 just doesn't even have the exploit and impact scores. And CNAs, I think, get to choose which
They do.
risk scoring version, and some will just do multiple. So they'll have
Yeah.
the V3 and V4. And looks like in the data set that OWASP used for this, there were only 6,000 CVEs that had a V4 risk score. So, excluding that from the calculations probably didn't have a real material impact on it, but it's just one other issue with the challenge of assigning risk scores already hard, and then building that list on the basis of an evolving risk scoring paradigm really hard. So this is also
Most of the scoring that we do and what I observe is CVSS 3.1.
okay. That's kind of the going
Yeah,
standard, if you will. Let
right.
people are operating at an N-1 for their risk scoring algo, where we're like, this is the latest stable version. V4 is still kind of getting worked out. This panel on the right over here is depicting some of the changes that happened in V4, which included some focus on operational technology and industrial control systems and IoT, which makes a lot of sense because those kinds of systems are proliferating at a rapid pace. But there's just a ton of new sort of data that they tried to incorporate into version 4.0, optional metrics like safety, automatability, and recovery. Um, they're trying to do a lot with this version that makes total sense with how it would have been hard to incorporate into the math that OWASP is doing. So okay, we're getting to our first discussion question. I'm hoping we're going to get some shout outs from audience people. We have one question already. How can I obtain the CL certificate for attending the webinar? We will note that you have asked that question, and we will reach out to you and send you the certificate afterwards. So we will be, for people that just joined, we're going to distribute the recording and the slides, and you can have a certificate for continuing education CPE credits if you want. Um, and we'll reach out afterwards, make sure to get you that certificate. So, okay, why does it matter when OWASP Top 10 is updated? This is a discussion question for us and for the audience. Like they update it every 4 years. What changes? Paul, like what's your view? Who cares? Who does something with this? How does it impact teams? What's the effect of an update to this list?
Yeah, well, I think for teams that are evaluating developers, let's say, and you want to make sure that yes, there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there, a lot of types of vulnerabilities, but what are the most common that are present and exploited? Having that top 10 list, I think, helps drive development teams to have an understanding of like, we got to make sure, at least in the first pass, we don't have anything's in the top 10 list. Are there others? Certainly. But these are the kind of ones you really want to worry about, right? Kind of similar to, prioritizing vulnerabilities based on what's being exploited. You know, that's kind of what this list represents, right? So,
Yeah, totally. I would love to hear if anybody in the audience actively uses OWASP. If it comes up, oh yes, thank you. Really good comment in the chat. Helps drive messaging to leadership. Things
mm,
change. That is, thank you for throwing that in there. The idea of, and this is something that I, even just, working in marketing for this company, having to develop a story about what matters to people It's like, what is actually happening out there in the world? How does it translate to our business? What matters? What do we need to, actions do we need to be taking internally? Messaging do we need to be communicating externally? Just it provides sort of a common basis of language and data that's been, analyzed by a reliable third party to form the foundation of arguments and decisions about like product direction or company direction or cybersecurity investments at the company. So using it as a basis to say, this isn't just me coming up with something. OWASP is saying that this is what we need to be concerned about, or this is what the community is concerned about. Here's the math that they did. This is why we need to address this particular source of risk. And that's going to be a huge aspect for the discussion that we have about the supply chain security element, because that's one where it ended up on the top three largely due to the community survey and less the data. And so that's a gap we'll talk about. Someone mentioned chat being disabled. Yeah, we don't have the live chat going, but you can throw anything in the Q&A and we'll bring it up. So if you want to introduce a discussion topic or have your question read out loud and answered, we'll talk about it. Yeah, driving messaging to leadership, really good point though, I think. Someone says, back to CVSS scoring, have you worked with any companies that add their own attribute or metric to the risk ranking calculation? Uh, Gosh, Paul, I don't know. What's your take on that? Our
Yeah,
friend,
I mean that's a thing. I think it's a great thing to add. So you can add your own compensating controls, for example, to kind of calculate your own score. I know there's a like a scoring tool that MITRE, I believe, makes available for people to do that. I think that was introduced in like 3.0 or something like that. I don't think that wasn't a 4.0 thing. It was before that. And that's a great thing to do. I don't see a lot of organizations using it unless they are, not really talking about it, but you should do that, right? Is the CVSS score is the score for the vulnerability, but contextualizing that in your own environment is really where it's at.
yeah, risk is so contextual. It's like a CVE on a vulnerability that's in a product that you don't have in your environment is zero risk to you. It's yeah, the context matters so much. It's a great point. All right. Someone says also software supply chain risk more difficult to manage, not software made in your
Yeah.
shop. That's a perfect segue into what we're talking about next, which is that the threat landscape has changed since 2021. That's a huge, like the OWASP top 10 is ultimately a map of the threat landscape viewed through a certain lens and a certain data set. And certain threat reports that we like to talk about a lot. The Verizon Data Breach Investigations report just looks at a phenomenal volume of actual data breaches and looks at their causes. And they noted a 34% increase in vulnerability exploitation in general, and an 8x increase in network and edge devices. And why we reference that in the context of the supply chain discussion is because network and edge devices are something that you procure into your environment. They contain software and firmware that you didn't write in-house, and often that you don't have actual access to be able to monitor or change or investigate. And so it's a supply chain risk that often does not get referenced in supply chain discussions. Supply chain is often kind of focused on, I mean, OWASP is about applications, okay, but when you sort of zoom out and think about what supply chain risk really means to your organization and in your context, there are enterprise devices in your environment that contain software, even open source libraries and stuff that you didn't build and that you can't monitor.
Right. And
This
that
is from
that's why
the,
attackers are going there.
yeah.
If you look at an average Windows PC today in your environment, it's got hopefully it has all these things. Hopefully it has secure boot. Hopefully it has some type of
Mhm.
EDR. Even Windows Defender has things like tamper protection and has gotten better over time. You can enable BitLocker. It's a pretty hardened environment, like those of us that do pen testing or have tried to implant and exploit a Windows PC. That's why a lot of people are keeping their own tradecraft once they figure it out. They oftentimes don't publish about it because that's their way in. And as that's become more difficult, I think attackers have kind of pivoted to, well, what can we exploit where there aren't all of those protections, that visibility is low. Obviously, you're going to monitor your Windows hosts, right? You're going to have some kind of EDR on there that potentially an attacker is going to trip up. But that stuff oftentimes does not exist more often than not. Very rare if it does that level of monitoring on your network and edge devices and appliances, security appliances as an example. And we see that in the that shift in the landscape, right?
Yeah.
That's what attackers are going. We've talked about it, Chase, on numerous different presentations. But those are some of the reasons why.
Yeah, it's a total tidal shift in the threat landscape, and it's represented really well. This graphic is from the Google Threat Intelligence Group's recent publication about the 0 days that they tracked that were exploited in 2025. So the inner green bar here is about half of the 0 days. There were 90 0 days that Google Threat Intelligence Group tracked as being actively exploited in 2025. Half of them, or 48%, were in enterprise products, and half of those, about 23%, were specifically in security and networking enterprise devices. So that's not they don't call it supply chain risk in that report. I don't think they use the word supply chain at all. And there's a difference to be noted between supply chain vulnerabilities versus supply chain attacks. But both of them, the words that they use in the OWASP top 10 list are software supply chain security failures. And when these security and networking devices contain some distribution of Linux under the covers that has open source components and modules that contain vulnerabilities. That's a software supply chain
Hmm.
failure, security failure, especially in the case where, as we often discuss, the security and networking appliances, like firewalls, which are increasingly targeted, have a vendor specific OS on top of it, like Cisco iOS XE or whatever. And then underneath that, there's Linux. And you, as a buyer, an enterprise administrator of that, can access the vendor OS, but you can't access the Linux underneath. And that's where the vulnerabilities are. So not only is it a supply chain risk, it's one that's obfuscated by the vendor. And this is something, this is a little outside the scope of what
Yeah,
a
but not
WASP
really,
is
because
strictly talking about. But go ahead, Paul.
I
Yeah.
was just saying most of those vendors don't produce an S-bomb and list all the components that
Yeah.
it's shipping with. So that's a supply chain issue is you're getting this box. It's got a bunch of software on there. Unless you're going manually and inspecting it,
Hmm.
you're not going to know what components are underneath. And again, what we found is that many vendors are shipping more software in that Linux open source ecosystem, as well as commercial software as well. And that landscape is increasing, right? As the devices get faster and you have more storage, you can say, yeah, sure, bring in a scripting language like Python or Lua or Ruby, and then all of those have dependencies, and now you've got a larger supply chain problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we've got a question in the chat, and I might need a little bit of clarification on it, or Paul, maybe you can just answer it as is. But are concentrated risks associated with software supply chain tracked by the same report? Do you mean by this Google Threat Intelligence report or by the OWASP list? If the asker can clarify that a little bit. So we talked a little bit about the CVE. Speaking of risk, we talked a little bit about the challenges of assigning those risk scores. And a conversation that Paul and I have had over and over is about the change in risk when a vulnerability requires authentication and therefore receives a lower risk score, and then an auth bypass vulnerability comes out in the same product and therefore increases the potential risk of the initial vulnerability. Um, I had my buddy Jim and I spit out this fun infographic about the difficulties in risk scoring chained vulnerabilities. But you've seen some real world examples of this recently, right, Paul? This is like,
Yeah, it's interesting when if I map well, so if I take vulnerabilities, right, that have are being exploited against network edge devices. And I look down at the vendor and I go, all right, for like the past couple of years, show me all the exploits that are in use for these devices. And I kind of, I have a lot of different tools that I use to sort and rank those. It's not just by CVSS score. I want to know if there's a public exploit for it, regardless of the CVSS score, right? I want to know if it's on the SysAkev or if it's been observed being exploited in the wild, right? Because those are two different things. Especially for Cisco, you'll see public exploitation as an indicator, but you won't necessarily find a public exploit. So I collect all that data and I end up with like a list of CVEs that are like, these are the ones in use. Then my next step is to go, what threat actor campaigns have used these particular exploits? And then you start to understand how they're using and where they're using those particular exploits and what their paths are. And so you get down to certain categories, right? And from a threat actor perspective, the category matters, right? If there is, for example, an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability, that is typically, let's just say it's memory corruption, right? So your classic buffer overflow attack, right? You worked in this field, but you probably heard that term fly around. Basically, you're manipulating the memory of your target to get it to run a program of your choosing. And that works great against these devices. It gets you access to that underlying Linux layer. If it doesn't require authentication, you can just spray that exploit to the entire internet and take control of these devices. Now, what will happen is sometimes let's just take this as an example. This was the case with, I forget which vendor it was, doesn't matter, right? If there is a remote code execution vulnerability, but the only way you can exploit it is if you're authenticated. So then the attacker either needs credentials or they need another vulnerability, right? They need an authentication bypass vulnerability that allows them access potentially to exploit that kind of internal buffer overflow vulnerability. And so I've seen threat actors do exactly that. They're chaining these exploits together, right? And you can chain a couple of different types. Command injection, slightly different type, right? That's where I can manipulate something and trick the system into running a command. I don't need to manipulate memory. And that's important because when you're manipulating memory in a remote code execution vulnerability, you've got to have it mapped to the system. It's typically specific to the version of the software that you're running or firmware on the device and specific to the architecture. Is it ARM or is it x86? Makes a big difference. If we talk about command injection, that doesn't even matter, right? So what attackers are doing is combining all of these together to exploit them. So from a threat landscape perspective and a risk management perspective, you have to be aware of the types of vulnerabilities that are present in your environment against your systems. Yes, you should patch all of them. Maybe you just patch the critical ones, but sometimes it's like a medium to a high severity kind of jump that the attackers are making. And those are really hard. Like I've asked people when I've done interviews on our podcast, right? I've asked many, many folks that work in this area, people from MITRE, people from CISA, how do we get a good handle on the problem of assigning a risk score to more than one vulnerability? And I don't get any great answers, which is frustrating, right? So you
Yeah.
have to pay attention to this data yourself.
Unsolved problem, and it notes here in the graphic that context is critical, as we talked about before.
Yeah.
Like ultimately, what's happening inside your environment is going to heavily influence, um, even more so than for an individual vulnerability. Your context really influences the risk that is represented by specific chain vulnerabilities. So some good takeaways here. I want to take another swat at the question that was asked before about concentrated risk. I think people usually use the term concentration risk to reference in a typical logistical supply chain. It's like if you only have one supplier for a particular resource, it's like, okay, I need like iron ore, and I only have one supplier, and that supplier runs out or has a mechanical failure. They can't deliver it, and my business is deeply affected because that key ingredient that I need doesn't I can't get it anymore because I only had one supplier. So organizations try to diversify their supply chain, have a couple of different suppliers for different uh, basic requirements. In the context of software supply chain risk, you definitely see that where if you are a Cisco shop or a, you know, Avanti shop or whatever, and it's like you've picked a single vendor to serve one of your needs, and then that vendor has a big issue or a big vulnerability, yeah, you have a huge problem then. But also, like using one vendor for a particular need, like one vendor for all your networking, one vendor for all your firewalls, is simplifies your operations, right? Because managing a multi-vendor environment um, for your IT stack is complicated. And there's not good like centralized management solutions. Each one has their own management stack too. And then you're doing patches across different kinds of vendors. They're on different patch schedule. Introduces a lot of complexity if you have multiple vendors, but it also hedges against risk. And so it turns into a very complicated assessment to do of how much benefit you get from having a multi-vendor situation versus using a single vendor for the simplicity, but then having a lot of exposure to that vendor's risk. That's not exactly the same as sort of concentration risk in a traditional logistical supply chain
Sure.
sense,
You
but I
remind me,
do
it
think it's
was
relevant.
like, was it Dan Gear with the kind of monolith, right? When they're talking about Microsoft's dominance in the market, right? And
Hmm.
the risks that that presents. It's somewhat related to that for sure.
Yeah,
And we've always had this struggle, right? When I've helped enterprises with their security programs, this often comes up. Do we go all in one vendor or do we diversify, right? And there's pros and cons to each.
yeah,
And you do gain some benefit by using the same vendor. The problem is if you start having a lot of problems with that vendor and you need to switch, the further you get down that vendor rabbit hole, the more difficult of a time you're going to have switching. There was a Bloomberg article about a particular vendor. Some of us may have read it, and they talk about how people did end up switching because of security reasons, end up switching vendors. And I've personally talked to CISOs who have made that same decision. So, you know, diversified or not, I think you have to be prepared to switch and have that plan and maybe design and plan things so that switching is not so much of a nightmare. Given some of the landscape stuff. I mean, if it's
yeah,
unavoidable, it's unavoidable. You got to stick with what you got. But the problem is, from a supply chain perspective, you don't control the supply chain that went into that device that got delivered to you that you've deployed on your network. So, and you're oftentimes limited in that visibility and security of it. So, again, that's why I think people are going to, well, I'm just going to switch vendors because I can't lock this down. I can't monitor it. It's got a lot of security problems. I got to go to something different.
yeah. I switched back to this graphic for a second because this is where that question came in. But I just wanted to note, as you said, certain vendors are hugely incumbent in certain realms. And I think maybe almost a quarter of the vulnerability is represented in that Google Threat Intelligence group thing. We're in Microsoft products specifically. And so it's like you start to look at the layout here and it's like, yeah, Microsoft has a huge install base and advantage, but a lot of the vulnerabilities that are happening are in their products as well, both enterprise and end user. And being so heavily reliant on an individual vendor in any sort of for any of your IT infrastructure needs does create a little bit of that kind of concentration risk that you're talking about. So I think that's a pretty good segue into our next topic. Although actually pausing for a moment for another user question, which I like. Paul, I think you will have a good answer to this, but what's a good source for looking up vulnerabilities in the wild? Where do you look to get your most reliable like CVE data or info about what's being exploited? I don't know if there is a good source. I know you do a
Yeah.
lot of work
So
on sourcing that data, but
I love this question. It's almost like it was teed up just for me. So I struggled with this, finding good sources to look up vulnerabilities. I will give a huge shout out to VulnCheck, because you can create a free account and they do have it's great intelligence source, and I do use them. Aside from that, when I started to look at where do I get this information about CVEs, about exploits, about whether or not they're on the Kev, I didn't find a great tool or resource. In fact, I went through a number of different tools over the years in my career. And like recently, many of those tools stopped working or weren't being maintained. And so what do you do in that situation is you build your own tool. So I built my own tool. Internally, I call it Weaver. It's like web interface for vulnerability research. And what it does is pull down a bunch of databases, the NVD database being one, a bunch of different exploit databases, the sysvul enrichment database, and it allows you to search, aggregates that all together, and then allows you to search it. So for this kind of stuff, I actually built my own tool, which I'm hoping we can release at some point, but I make no promises.
Yeah. Caution, exercising caution on future facing statements, but that would be
Yeah.
cool. But that's a good segue into this next topic, which is about the underlying vulnerability data set and CWE data set that supports the supply chain security failure item in the OWASP list. So this is a depiction of the OWASP top 10 list by CWEs
Yeah.
that are
I
mapped to
think
CVEs. And it's crazy. There's only 6 CWEs and 11 CVEs out of
And like how many CWEs do we have total? Is it like almost 300 or 250?
641.
Yeah,
641.
it's
Yeah.
way too many. It's
Yeah.
way too many. Because also you could almost categorize all of them as a broken access control.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
every single
Those are the abstraction.
vulnerability,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, at its core, every single vulnerability is essentially a broken access control. But then you've also got CWEs that are out there that are like never used. Right.
Hmm.
And some of that, I believe, is because there's another CWE that is used and they're just duplicates. And so they haven't done a great job, in my opinion, of deduplicating that. Um, and we kind of walk this line. And I'm not saying it's an easy problem to solve, but it is a hard problem. Like how granular you get, do you make it very high level? Then there's a whole bunch of stuff lumped into major categories. And how useful is that? But then if you end up with too many, and it's too dispersed, is that useful, right? I kind of like the examples I gave before, right? Is it an authentication bypass? Is it remote code execution that's a buffer overflow? Is it command injection, right? Those are some of the like driving factors for me when I evaluate the severity and impact of a vulnerability. That's primarily what I'm looking at, right? I'm like, does it require authentication? That's huge. Um, you know, but even there's other factors with authentication, like did the user set a default or weak credential, right? So whether that's present in your environment comes back to your contextualized risk. Like, have you checked if your devices accept a default and or weak credential, which is also, side note, an activity that I believe more people need to do because it changes the risk calculation of your vulnerabilities that require authentication, right? So, but also back to CWE, I think there's too many. Also, I think there's cases where stuff gets lumped into a more generic category like broken access control. And so how we use this data then is it somewhat negatively impacts how we can use CWE. Like, what's it telling me? Like, it's a broken access control. Okay, well, like, what do I do with that?
Yeah. It's like it's all kind of a attempt at consolidating and categorizing these enormous lists. You have a
Yeah,
list of several 100,000 CVEs, and they're like, man, that's too much. It's not all real. How can we help people navigate that? Okay, we'll do the CWEs. And each CWE is more of a categorical representation that many CVE, a CVE is in a specific product or system. A CWE is like a type of weakness that can exist. But then there's too many of those. And so they're like, okay, now we're going to make this top 10 list where we
right.
consolidate the hundreds and hundreds of CWEs and we create these new categories. And we tell you which ones are the top 10 most urgent ones to deal with. And as I'm looking at this, I have a question in my mind that maybe I have already come to the answer to, but if there were 641 CWEs that had CVEs mapped to them, these numbers here don't add up to 641. And so I'm
Yeah.
wondering if some of those ended up just not, they didn't make it to the top 10. Like maybe OWASP
Right. Yeah.
they've got more than 10 items, but these are the 10 that made to the top 10 list based on all the math. But this is where we get to the really interesting thing about the supply chain failures is that it's got this tiny number of CWEs, okay, 6 out of 641, so less than 1%, and 11 CVEs, so that's like 100th of a percent of all the CVEs, or maybe 1/10 of a percent. Don't make me do math. But the data that underlies this category is pretty small, but half of the survey respondents said this was their number one concern. Um, I guess a side note that's worth mentioning is that the software supply chain failure, security failure is sort of an expansion of a previously existing category called vulnerable and outdated components. And that
Yeah.
is relevant because as we're
Well, it's
talking
different.
about, yeah, exactly, the
Like
supply
it's
chain, a bigger
SolarWinds
lens.
SolarWinds versus Log4j, right?
Yeah,
Both
yeah.
are supply chain problems, but SolarWinds was there was a threat actor
Hmm.
actively abusing the supply chain, right? But with Log4j, it was a vulnerable component that was included, which is also a supply chain issue, but not necessarily tied back to a threat actor.
Yeah.
XZ is could have been a much more dangerous threat actor style attack. And I kind of hope actually that some of the concern is driven by some of these events, right? I think we just got lucky with XZ. I mean, the threat actors were literally after a backdoor in every Linux SSH
Hmm.
instance. Like that's a pretty lofty goal. And the scary part is they almost got there, right? But in Log4j, impactful, but in a very different way, right? It introduced a vulnerability into your code. Still concerning, but like different takes on the supply chain angle.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I mean, kudos to OWASP for introducing it and using the supply chain language, because I think part of the growing fear about it is that there is less standardized language and framing to talk about supply chain risk than there is for other types. Like when you say supply chain, I think a lot of people go to open source libraries and like hardened containers and stuff is the topic. Um, that comes up. And really, the supply chain is a lot broader than that. And we've got these examples of supply chain attacks and vulnerabilities, I should have put in the title here, that are just very different, but all highly impactful to certain organizations, depending again on the context. You mentioned SolarWinds, that was, a big enterprise technology whose software update path, the official update channel that the SolarWinds used to deliver updates to customers, was compromised and used by attackers to distribute malware or, potentially. Log4j and executils, like executils, it's an open source component, right? And so attackers infiltrated the open source community, those managing that component, to try to introduce a backdoor into it.
Right. Well, that was true for XZ.
Yeah.
Log4j, I think, was
Yeah,
just a
right,
vulnerability.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like two different ways. Like you could
Yep.
accidentally have a vulnerability in a widely used open source package, or an attacker can intentionally try to infiltrate the update chain for it. Um, then the F5 situation we talked about a bunch sort of late last year, that's a whole other one where it's like, okay, F5 as a company got hacked and their source code got stolen and vulnerabilities that they hadn't yet disclosed. They were probably, they probably knew and were working on a patches. You don't want to disclose it till you have the patch. Um, but then those vulnerabilities fell into the hands of attackers, and that created a lot of supply chain fear among big enterprises that use those products. It's like,
I feel like you missed a big one here, though, Chase.
uh-oh,
We can't forget the Star Wars thermal exhaust port. I mean, that's a supply
exactly.
chain. That's a
One
supply
of the most
chain,
canonical of all time.
right? This is a great question from the audience too. Sometimes I think this operational technology risk that cannot always be updated. So is it supply chain or just inherent risk that must be mitigated because of outdated software? I think you're spot on. I agree wholeheartedly that at the end of the day, right, your response to a supply chain vulnerability, as an example, like Log4j. like not XZ, but Log4j is a great example where it's a vulnerability that has to be mitigated. Yes, it was a supply chain vulnerability, but your response operationally is essentially the same. I got to patch something to mitigate the risk. And I observe vendors doing this all the time that use open source components. They're constantly like, hey, there's a new firmware update because this other utility in Linux or library had a vulnerability, so we had to update it. And it just comes down to operational risk. And the remediation is I got to update my systems. And that, I believe me, I empathize, is not easy, right? It's not an easy process to do that because then while there's a security risk because you have a vulnerable component, there's also the operational risk of when I update this thing, is it going to cause operational problems? So you have this kind of double whammy to deal with that we've all been dealing with since the beginning of time when we had to update software.
Yeah, 100%. Someone else shouted out in the chat, don't forget to mention Red Hat breach. Yeah, Red Hat's GitLab instance was
Oh yeah.
compromised, and that potentially disclosed information about there's a lot of different ways that this type of threat or vulnerability can manifest itself, and the sheer complexity of the supply chain and the
Yep.
chains of vulnerabilities
Avanti
that
was
exist.
one too. That was covered in
Yeah,
the Bloomberg article. Yep.
this very recent new update from CISA about resurge malware that targets Ivanti products was super
Speaking of
interesting
Avanti,
to me
yeah.
because it affected a open source firmware component called Core Boot in Ivanti Pulse Secure products, which is firmware, supply chain security, and the firmware and underlying OS that exists inside network gear is something that Eclipsium is heavily focused on researching and supporting our customers with securing. So that one stood out to us because this is a firmware component that's being actively decrypted, modified, and re-encrypted in order to establish persistence and evade detection. And it's a firmware component inside these network edge devices, VPN firewall type gear. And
It's
that's,
it's interesting. I often get asked the question in Core Boot is sometimes the driver of that, where Core Boot is actually an open source BIOS, if you will. I mean, it's UEFI. It does use UEFI, but it's not strictly UEFI. So it's kind of its own mechanism that enables your hardware, just like UEFI, right? And so people often ask me, is it more secure to have open source firmware like Core Boot than more of a closed ecosystem like UEFI? Now, UEFI has an open source reference implementation EDK2, but oftentimes the when you get most of the time, right, when you get a laptop or a PC, it has the vendor's version of that, which is commercial software. And so, the question is which one's more secure? Like I don't think it's not really comparing apples to apples, and also it doesn't matter, right? Sometimes I kind of feel like the open source software or firmware can be attackers can have an easier time backdooring it, like you described, Chase, because it is open source, right? But that's not to say you can't backdoor or exploit vulnerabilities in commercial UEFI firmware, which has been done many, many times, a lot by our founders and research team, right? So.
yeah, 100%. So to the question of like, is it supply chain risk or is it inherent risk that must be mitigated because of outdated software? Yeah, that's part of the challenge that we're seeing here, right? Is that there's not standardized language to identify what you consider supply chain risk and how you allocate responsibility for that. One of the ways that people think of supply chain security is doing sort of security questionnaires with their vendors, right? Where they require vendors to attest to their security practices, saying, here's how we secure our business, here's how we secure the software that we're selling you. And that's an important thing to do to get them to say what they're doing, but it only goes so far. And when those same vendors are not going to, something we would advocate for is that you should do that, have the vendors attest to their security practices, but also you should be able to have visibility and monitoring capability on your own end so that you can manage and monitor and detect potential introduction of risk through those products that may or may not have come out in the sort of point in time survey or attestation that you got. So when we talk about what software supply chain failures mean, it's like back to that original amazing comment, I think from that same person actually, that a big part of what OWASP is used for is to drive messaging to leadership, having that common language and common foundation of how you talk about it. And supply chain just doesn't quite have it yet. It sort of has this limited scope that doesn't quite cover everything that it should fall underneath it. Anonymous attendee says it's easier to get a vendor's questionnaire than an S-bomb. Boy,
So
howdy, we'll
true.
get into that. We would love to talk about S-bombs. And Eclipsium is able to deliver S-bombs for tons of stuff inside your environment, including those network devices, where it's really difficult to get them. So we'll talk about that. I don't want to get there too soon, but we do need to keep going because we are. This has been such a great conversation that we're getting down on time, but I want to make sure to cover the rest of this great material. But what OWASP Top 10 says in their latest update about software supply chain failures is that there are breakdowns or other compromises in the process of building, distributing, or updating software, often caused by vulnerabilities or malicious changes in third-party code tools or other dependencies that the system relies on. I don't know why this quote got kind of mangled. I must have copy pasted it poorly. But when we talk about supply chain, yeah, often it's in this context of like software updates, but any given device that you might have in your environment has tons and tons of components in it that have gone through a bunch of different manufacturers. Has chips with built-in firmware. It's got software, it's got its basic operating system. It's probably gone through distributor or some sort of VAR. There's just so many hands touch these things before they make it into um, an enterprise IT environment. And as it becomes clearer that the supply chain is a place that both introduces accidental vulnerabilities that can be discovered and exploited, and is a place where attackers can proactively invade the supply chain for these open source components or hardware, or commercial components and introduce risk intentionally, it becomes clear that we need to expand the scope of what we mean by supply chain security. And I think the term cyber supply chain risk management is a good, that one is getting closer to the right scope to talk about this. But something we talk about internally a lot is yeah, taking it beyond applications, how hardware and firmware fit into supply chain security, and just trying to depict the scope of providers that deliver, for a single Dell laptop, the number of companies and factories and programmers and individuals that put that laptop in your environment. Very difficult for a supply chain that looks like this to compellingly attest to the security of the product. And so you, as an end user, an admin, an enterprise admin, need the ability to test and verify that stuff. This was a quote that I liked from the creator of the OWASP top 10 list, Jeff Williams. Created, I think he's since departed OWASP, but he says they changed the name of the thing that covers libraries to supply chain security to try to make it a little bit broader. This is him commenting on the 2025 update. And I think that framing says a lot about both the original scope of the term supply chain and the need to expand it. Is that he was thinking of it as the thing that covers libraries, and a lot of people think of it that way, and that's a legitimate component of it.
Hmm.
XZUtils, Log4j, these are libraries, but SolarWinds, Core Boot, F5, there's a lot of other supply chain stuff that isn't the same as just libraries that needs to be part of any sort of supply chain risk management messaging and mindset. It needs to be how leadership and how individual contributors are talking about it. He says, I think that's a little dangerous because most people care about CVEs a lot and less working on the whole supply chain. That's the problem. He's saying it's dangerous to have changed the name to expand it because people aren't really working on the whole supply chain. And that's exactly the issue that we're talking about, is that they need to focus on the whole supply chain. Um, Another quote from Jeff talking about just the fact that in order for this to change, the OWASP top 10 list has been around for like 25 years, right? How much has changed? How long has broken access control been number one? You know, several iterations.
Mhm.
But right now, there is legislation happening globally. He mentions this thing that the EU did with their product liability directive. I think what he's talking about is the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU, which entered into force in December of 2024. And by December 2027, going back to our commenter's note about S-bombs, there's going to be full enforcement, including S-bomb requirements. And what the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU says, this is going to be like a GDPR level impact. Like this is meteoric. Is that companies that are producing digital products or software are going to have to provide S-bombs both up and down the chain. So to their end users, and also to any like anybody who's incorporating, anywhere along the supply chain, you're going to have to report like, hey, built. Here's what we built into our thing, and here's what we're delivering to you, and we'll be held liable for negative impacts of that. So who knows what that's going to look like? But GDPR had a massive impact because organizations that are doing business with that region at all, which global enterprises do business in Europe, turns out, they're going to have to figure out how to achieve these levels of visibility into their own supply chain and provide that level of visibility to their customers in a way that just has not been the standard so far. So we like to think about supply chain risk management across all of the sort of stages of technology inside of an enterprise. You have to be able to scan devices and software when they come into your environment before, during procurement, before it actually gets deployed to make sure that you got what you paid for and that doesn't have any unknown risk factors, attack surfaces, vulnerabilities, et cetera. Then have to be able to monitor stuff during operations because if log4j or executils, that's a supply chain attack, you already have a bunch of log4j running in your environment. We know that there are many vulnerable instances of the log4j package still out there in enterprise operations. Um, that's a supply chain risk in your devices that are already running, and you need to be able to find those and mitigate those risks either through updating and patching or through other defense in depth approaches. And then this is sort of an under discussed one, but decommissioning, especially as the sort of AI data center situation makes everything insanely expensive, every aspect of compute insane. Any sort of digital product, super expensive. The gray market is expanding, the secondary market. And we've had customers that bought devices that they thought were new that turned out to have another big company's data still on them. And so they learned that that was actually a used device or component that they had plugged in. And they were like, well, how do we stop this from happening to us? We don't want our devices that we decommission going out into the gray market and accidentally having our data get plugged into someone else's. So this is all part of the supply chain that is way above and beyond what we mean when we talk about application security. But so yeah, procurement, operations, decommissioning. I'm speed running through these because we're getting close on time. Ultimately, expanding the scope and having a clear understanding for yourself that you can use to talk to both your teammates and your management about what supply chain risk really means. And I'm glad that we have this item on the OWASP list as sort of a starter pack for that. Um, Someone says not true. EU CRA will come into force next year. Some part will come into effect. Yeah, it's a staggered rollout. You're absolutely right. That was a simplified graph. Some of it's already in force. Some of it's coming into force this year, some next year, which makes it kind of even harder. Like which parts do we have to comply with now? What's coming later? And then someone says one problem is an SBOM changes with updates. Yeah, 100%. This is a challenge we face all the time. Some SBOM standards will be packaged right with the software, and some of them can't. Like some software just can't have an SBOM with it. And so you've got separate delivery chain for the SBOM versus the software. It can't be bundled together, and it can get out of sync really easily. And something that does is helps basically generate those SBOMs on the fly. So we look at the devices that are in your environment and generate the SBOM of what's actually in there, and then compare it to what the vendor SBOM says and tell you if there's a difference between there. And we can use that to monitor the integrity of devices over time, tell you if there's been any malicious changes or tampering with the individual binaries inside those devices. So being able to generate your own SBOMs for devices you have in operations is a really great way to get actual data with which to either make good security decisions or hold your vendors accountable for what they're delivering to you. Okay, that was a long soliloquy from me. Thank you so much, everybody. Paul, do you have any last tidbits you want to drop on the folks before we drop? Thank you so much, everybody, for listening in and participating. This has been a spectacular conversation, and
No, I think we're at time. That was great.
we're at time. Deeply appreciate everybody's participation, and we'll get those continuing education credits and slides and recording out to you ASAP. Thanks so much, everybody, and have
Thanks,
a
everyone.
wonderful afternoon, evening.
Again.